It was a busy Monday morning at the downtown branch of one of the city's largest banks. The line stretched almost to the door, and the air was thick with impatience. Among the crowd stood an elderly black woman, her gray hair neatly tied back, clutching a worn leather handbag. She had been waiting for over an hour, her patience wearing thin but her demeanor calm. She was there to resolve an issue with her late husband's account, something she had been putting off for months. When her turn finally came, she approached the counter with a polite smile. The young bank employee, barely out of college, barely glanced at her. "How can I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped and dismissive. The woman explained her situation, handing over the necessary documents. The employee skimmed through them, his expression growing skeptical. "This account has been flagged for suspicious activity," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the bank to hear. "Are you sure this is your husband's account?" The woman's face flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, it is," she replied softly. "He passed away last year, and I've been trying to sort out his affairs." The employee wasn't convinced. He began questioning her aggressively, demanding more proof of her identity and her relationship to the account holder. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to each other, but no one stepped forward to help. The woman's hands trembled as she fumbled through her bag for more documents, her dignity slipping away with each passing second. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," the employee said finally, sliding her documents back across the counter. "You'll need to speak to someone higher up, but they're not available today." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She gathered her things and turned to leave, her head held high despite the humiliation. Just as she reached the door, a deep, commanding voice echoed through the bank. "Wait." Everyone turned to see a tall, well-dressed man stepping forward. His presence was magnetic, his eyes sharp and focused. He had been standing quietly in the corner, observing the entire scene. Now, he walked straight to the counter, his expression unreadable but his tone firm. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. The bank employee hesitated, suddenly unsure of himself. "This woman's account has been flagged for fraud," he stammered. "I was just following protocol." The man glanced at the elderly woman, his gaze softening for just a moment. Then he turned back to the employee, his voice low but firm. "Protocol doesn't include humiliating a customer in front of everyone. Get your manager. Now." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. The elderly woman stood frozen, unsure of what was happening but feeling a glimmer of hope. The audience is left on the edge of their seats, eager to know who this mysterious man is and how he will change everything. The elderly woman stood silently, clutching her handbag tightly, as the well-dressed man waited for the manager. Her mind raced, not just about the humiliation she had just endured, but about the life that had led her to this moment. She had always been a woman of quiet strength, someone who faced challenges head-on but never sought the spotlight. Her name was Margaret, though most people in her neighborhood simply called her Miss Maggie. She had lived in the same small house for over 40 years, a place filled with memories of her late husband, Joseph. They had met as teenagers, two young dreamers who believed in hard work and the power of love. Joseph had been her rock, her partner in every sense of the word. Together, they had raised 3 children, sent them to college, and watched them build lives of their own. But life hadn't been easy. Joseph had worked long hours as a mechanic, often coming home with grease-stained hands and a tired smile. Margaret had taken on odd jobs, cleaning houses, sewing clothes, even selling homemade pies at the local market, to make ends meet. They had scraped together every penny to give their children a better life, and they had succeeded. But it had come at a cost. When Joseph passed away unexpectedly the previous year, Margaret had been left to navigate the world alone for the first time in decades. His death had left a void she couldn't fill, but it had also left practical matters to deal with, like the bank account they had shared for over 30 years. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a symbol of the life they had built together. Margaret had tried to handle everything on her own, but the paperwork had been overwhelming. She had made multiple trips to the bank, each time being told she needed another document, another form, another signature. Today had been her final attempt, her last hope of closing this chapter of her life. But instead of finding resolution, she had found humiliation. As she stood there, waiting for the manager, her thoughts drifted to her children. They had offered to help, of course, but Margaret had insisted on doing this herself. She didn't want to burden them, not when they had their own families and responsibilities. Besides, she had always prided herself on her independence. The manager, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, arrived at the counter. She glanced at Margaret, then at the well-dressed man, and finally at the employee who had caused the scene. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone sharp. The well-dressed man didn't mince words. This woman was treated with disrespect and accused of fraud without cause. "I suggest you rectify the situation immediately." The manager's eyes widened as she recognized the man. She quickly turned to Margaret, her tone softening. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. Let's get this sorted out right away." Margaret nodded, still too shaken to speak. She followed the manager to a private office, the well-dressed man close behind. As they walked, she couldn't help but wonder who this man was and why he had stepped in to help her. Inside the office, the manager reviewed Margaret's documents carefully. It didn't take long for her to realize there had been a mistake, a simple clerical error that had flagged the account. She apologized profusely and assured Margaret that everything would be resolved by the end of the day. Margaret felt a wave of relief, but it was mixed with exhaustion. She had spent so much energy trying to fix this problem, and now it was finally over. She turned to the well-dressed man, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know who you are, but you didn't have to do that." The man smiled, a warm, genuine smile that put her at ease. "It was the right thing to do," he replied. "No one should be treated that way, especially not someone like you." Margaret didn't know what to say. She had spent so much of her life giving to others, putting their needs before her own. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable, to be on the receiving end of such kindness. As she left the bank that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She didn't know it yet, but this incident would be the start of something much bigger, a story that would inspire countless others and remind the world of the power of dignity, resilience, and standing up for what is right. Margaret stepped out of the bank, the cool morning air brushing against her face. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The encounter had left her emotionally drained, but there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, she felt like someone had truly seen her, not just as an elderly woman, but as a person deserving of respect. As she walked down the street, her thoughts kept returning to the well-dressed man who had intervened. Who was he? Why had he stepped in when no one else had? She didn't even know his name, but his calm authority and quiet kindness had left a lasting impression. Back inside the bank, the atmosphere was tense. The manager had returned to her office, leaving the young employee to face the consequences of his actions. The well-dressed man stood near the counter, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. The other customers had slowly returned to their business, but the incident had left a mark on everyone who had witnessed it. The young employee, now visibly nervous, approached the man. I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he stammered. "I was just following the rules." The man turned to him, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Rules are important," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But so is how we treat people. That woman didn't deserve to be humiliated, no matter what the rules say." The employee nodded, his face flushed with shame. "I understand. I'll do better next time." The man didn't respond immediately. He glanced around the bank, taking in the bustling activity, the customers waiting in line, the employees behind the counters. It was a scene he had seen countless times before, but today it felt different. Today, he had seen the cracks in the system, the way small injustices could go unnoticed or ignored. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to the employee. "If you're serious about doing better, start by remembering this moment. And if you ever need guidance, don't hesitate to reach out." The employee took the card, his eyes widening as he read the name and title printed on it. He looked up, but the man was already walking away, his focus shifting to the manager who had returned to the lobby. "We need to talk," the man said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The manager nodded, her demeanor professional but her eyes betraying a hint of anxiety. She led him to a private conference room, closing the door behind them. Once they were alone, the man didn't waste any time. "What happened today was unacceptable," he said, his voice low but firm. "That woman has been a loyal customer for decades, and she was treated like a criminal. This isn't just about one employee, it's about the culture of this branch, and possibly the entire company." The manager nodded, her face pale. "I understand, sir. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." "You'll do more than that," the man replied. "You'll review your training protocols, your customer service policies, and your hiring practices. And you'll report back to me with a plan to ensure that every customer who walks through these doors is treated with dignity and respect." The manager swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of the situation. "Yes, sir. I'll get started right away." The man leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about avoiding bad publicity or keeping customers happy. It's about doing the right thing. That woman, Margaret, she's someone's mother, someone's grandmother. She's a person who has worked hard her entire life, who has faced challenges most of us can't imagine. And she deserved better than what she got today." The manager nodded again, her respect for the man growing with every word. She had always known him as a powerful figure, someone who commanded respect and got results. But today, she saw a different side of him, a man who cared deeply about people, who believed in fairness and justice. As the meeting wrapped up, the man stood to leave. "I'll be checking in on your progress," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And I expect to see real change." The manager watched him go, her mind racing with everything she needed to do. But as she sat there, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. This was a chance to make a difference, not just for the bank, but for the people it served. Meanwhile, the man stepped out of the bank and into the sunlight. He paused for a moment, his thoughts turning to Margaret. He didn't know her story, but he could see the strength in her eyes, the quiet dignity that had stayed with him long after she had left. He made a mental note to follow up with her, to ensure that she was treated with the respect she deserved. But more than that, he felt a sense of responsibility, not just to her, but to everyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard. As he walked away, he knew that this was just the beginning. The incident at the bank had exposed a problem, but it had also revealed an opportunity to create real change, to make a difference in the lives of people like Margaret. And he was determined to take it. The news of what had happened at the bank spread quickly, not just among the employees but also through the small community. People talked about the elderly woman who had been humiliated and the mysterious man who had stepped in to defend her. Rumors swirled about who he was and why he had been there in the first place. Some said he was a high-ranking executive, others whispered he was a wealthy philanthropist, and a few even speculated he was a government official. But Margaret didn't pay much attention to the rumors. She was just grateful that the ordeal was over and that her late husband's account had finally been resolved. She returned home that afternoon, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. She sat in her favorite chair by the window, the one where Joseph used to read the newspaper every morning, and let out a long sigh. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was her daughter, calling to check in. Margaret hesitated for a moment before answering. She didn't want to worry her children, but she also knew she couldn't keep this to herself. "Mom, are you okay?" her daughter asked, her voice filled with concern. "You sound tired." Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just had a long day at the bank." Her daughter listened quietly as Margaret recounted what had happened, her voice trembling slightly as she described the humiliation and the kindness of the stranger who had intervened. By the time she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mom, I'm so sorry," her daughter said finally, her voice choked with emotion. "I wish I had been there with you." "It's okay," Margaret replied, forcing a smile. It's over now. And that man, he reminded me that there are still good people in the world. Her daughter sighed. I just hate that you had to go through that. You spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. You deserve to be treated with respect. Margaret didn't respond. She had always believed that respect was something you earned, not something you demanded. But today had shaken that belief, just a little. Meanwhile, at the bank, the well-dressed man was busy making changes. He had spent the afternoon meeting with the branch manager and her team, reviewing their policies and procedures. He had listened to their concerns, answered their questions, and challenged them to do better. But he knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and a commitment to doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. And he was determined to see it through. As the day drew to a close, he decided to pay Margaret a visit. He didn't know her address, but he had asked the manager to look it up for him. It wasn't something he normally did, visiting customers at home, but something about Margaret had stayed with him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a connection to her, a sense of responsibility that went beyond his role at the bank. When he arrived at her house, he hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. He didn't want to intrude, but he also wanted to make sure she was okay. Margaret opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him standing there. "Oh. It's you," she said, her voice soft but warm. "I didn't expect to see you again." The man smiled. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to check in and make sure everything was taken care of." Margaret stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "You're not disturbing me at all. Please, come in." He followed her into the living room, taking in a cozy space filled with photographs and mementos. It was clear that this was a home filled with love and memories, and he felt a deep sense of respect for the woman who had built it. They sat down, and Margaret offered him a cup of tea, which he accepted gratefully. As they talked, he learned more about her life, her marriage, her children, her struggles and triumphs. He was struck by her resilience, her quiet strength, and her unwavering faith in the goodness of people. "You've lived an incredible life," he said finally, his voice filled with admiration. "And you've faced challenges that would have broken most people. But you've never let them define you." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "I've just tried to do my best," she said simply. "That's all any of us can do, isn't it?" The man nodded, feeling a deep sense of humility. He had come here to check on her, but he realized that she had given him something far more valuable, a reminder of what truly mattered. Before he left, he handed her his business card. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call," he said. "And if anyone at the bank gives you trouble, you let me know." Margaret took the card, her hands trembling slightly as she read the name and title printed on it. Her eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't say anything. She simply nodded, her gratitude evident in her expression. As he walked back to his car, the man felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was going to make sure that no one else had to go through what Margaret had experienced. And he was going to start by making sure that the bank lived up to its promise of treating every customer with dignity and respect. The days that followed the incident at the bank were anything but ordinary. For Margaret, life seemed to take on a new rhythm, one filled with unexpected kindness and a renewed sense of hope. For the well-dressed man, whose name she now knew was Robert, it was a time of reflection and action. And for the community, it was a moment of awakening, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage and compassion could create ripples that touched countless lives. Margaret's story began to spread, not just through word of mouth but also through local news outlets. A reporter had caught wind of what had happened and reached out to her for an interview. At first, Margaret was hesitant. She had never been one to seek attention, and the thought of sharing her story with strangers made her uneasy. But her children encouraged her, reminding her that her experience could inspire others and bring about positive change. "Mom, this isn't just about you," her daughter said gently. "It's about standing up for what's right and showing people that they don't have to accept being treated poorly." Margaret thought about it for a long time before finally agreeing. When the reporter arrived at her home, she welcomed her with the same warmth and grace she extended to everyone. She spoke candidly about what had happened at the bank, her voice steady but her emotions close to the surface. She talked about her late husband, her family, and the values that had guided her through life. And she spoke about Robert, the man who had stepped in when no one else would. He didn't have to do what he did, she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. But he saw me as a person, not just a problem to be dealt with. And that made all the difference. The article was published a few days later, and it quickly went viral. People from all walks of life were moved by Margaret's story, her resilience, her dignity, and her unwavering faith in the goodness of others. Many shared their own experiences of being mistreated or overlooked, and the conversation began to shift toward the importance of empathy and respect in everyday interactions. Meanwhile, Robert was busy implementing changes at the bank. He had always believed in the power of leadership to inspire and transform, but this experience had deepened his commitment to creating a culture of kindness and accountability. He held meetings with employees at every level, listening to their concerns and ideas, and challenging them to think differently about how they treated customers and each other. One of the first changes he made was to introduce mandatory training sessions focused on empathy and customer service. He brought in experts to lead workshops and encouraged employees to share their own stories and experiences. He also established a new policy that allowed customers to provide feedback directly to senior management, ensuring that their voices would be heard and acted upon. But Robert knew that real change went beyond policies and procedures. It was about creating a sense of shared responsibility, a belief that every person who walked through the bank's doors deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. And it was about recognizing the humanity in everyone, from the elderly woman struggling to close her late husband's account to the young employee trying to do his job. As the weeks passed, the impact of these changes began to ripple outward. Employees reported feeling more connected to their work and more motivated to go the extra mile for customers. Customers, in turn, noticed the difference and began to share their positive experiences with others. The bank's reputation, which had taken a hit after the incident, began to improve, and people started to see it as a place that truly cared about its community. But the ripples didn't stop there. Inspired by Margaret's story, other businesses in the area began to reevaluate their own practices. A local restaurant introduced training programs for its staff, focusing on kindness and inclusivity. A grocery store launched a campaign to support elderly customers, offering them assistance with shopping and delivery services. Even schools got involved, teaching students about the importance of empathy and standing up for what's right. For Margaret, the outpouring of support was overwhelming. She received letters and phone calls from people across the country, many of whom shared their own stories of struggle and resilience. Some thanked her for speaking out, while others simply wanted to let her know that she had inspired them to be kinder and more compassionate in their own lives. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a young woman who had been struggling with self-doubt and feelings of inadequacy. She wrote that Margaret's story had reminded her of the power of dignity and the importance of standing up for oneself, even in the face of adversity. "You may not realize it," the letter read, "but your courage has given me the strength to keep going. Thank you for showing me that no matter how hard life gets, we can always choose to rise above it." Margaret read the letter several times, her heart swelling with emotion. She had never thought of herself as courageous or inspiring, but the words on the page made her see herself in a new light. As she sat in her favorite chair by the window, she thought about all that had happened, the humiliation at the bank, the kindness of a stranger, the outpouring of support from her community. It was a lot to process, but one thing was clear, her story had touched people in ways she could never have imagined. And she knew that this was just the beginning. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change, not just for Margaret but for everyone whose lives had been touched by her story. What had started as a moment of humiliation at a bank had blossomed into a movement of kindness, empathy, and accountability. Margaret, who had always lived a quiet and unassuming life, found herself at the center of it all, not because she sought the spotlight, but because her story had resonated with people in a way that few could have predicted. Robert, the well-dressed man who had stepped in that fateful day, became a close friend and ally. He visited Margaret regularly, not out of obligation but because he genuinely enjoyed her company. They would sit in her cozy living room, sipping tea and sharing stories. Robert often marveled at her wisdom and grace, qualities that had only deepened with age. "You've taught me so much," he said to her one afternoon. "About resilience, about kindness, about what it means to truly care for others." Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "And you've reminded me that there are still good people in the world," she replied. "People who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's not easy." Their friendship was a testament to the power of human connection, a reminder that even the most unlikely relationships can blossom when rooted in mutual respect and understanding. As the community continued to rally around Margaret, she found herself embracing her new role as a symbol of hope and inspiration. She was invited to speak at local events, where she shared her story with humility and grace. Her message was simple but powerful: no matter who you are or what you've been through, you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And if you ever find yourself in a position to help someone else, don't hesitate. You never know how much of a difference you might make. Her words struck a chord with everyone who heard them. People began to see her not just as an elderly woman who had faced injustice, but as a beacon of light in a world that often felt dark and uncertain. Her story became a rallying cry for kindness, a reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion could create ripples that touched countless lives. But Margaret's impact wasn't limited to her community. Her story reached far beyond the borders of her small town, inspiring people across the country and even around the world. A documentary filmmaker reached out to her, asking if he could tell her story on a larger scale. At first, Margaret was hesitant. She had never sought fame or recognition, and the idea of sharing her life with strangers felt overwhelming. But her children encouraged her, reminding her that her story had the power to inspire and uplift people in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "Mom, this isn't just about you," her son said. "It's about showing people that no matter how hard life gets, there's always hope. And that's a message the world needs to hear." Margaret thought about it for a long time before finally agreeing. The documentary, titled A Life of Dignity, was released to critical acclaim. It chronicled her journey, from her humble beginnings to the challenges she had faced, and ultimately, to the moment that had changed everything. But more than that, it celebrated her resilience, her kindness, and her unwavering belief in the goodness of people. The film sparked a global conversation about empathy and respect, prompting businesses, schools, and organizations to reevaluate their practices and prioritize kindness in their interactions. Margaret's story became a case study in leadership programs, a reminder that true leadership isn't about power or prestige, but about standing up for what's right and treating people with dignity. As the years passed, Margaret continued to live her life with the same quiet strength and grace that had always defined her. She remained close to Robert, who had become like family to her. Together, they worked on initiatives to support elderly individuals in their community, ensuring that no one else would have to face the kind of humiliation she had experienced. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, Robert turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Margaret," he said, "you've changed so many lives, including mine. What do you think is the most important lesson you've learned?" Margaret paused, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think the most important lesson is that we're all connected," she said finally. "Our actions, no matter how small, have the power to touch others in ways we may never fully understand. And if we can remember that, if we can treat each other with kindness and respect, we can make the world a better place, one person at a time." Robert nodded, his heart swelling with admiration. "You're a remarkable woman, Margaret," he said. "And the world is a better place because of you." Margaret smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And it's a better place because of people like you, Robert. People who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's not easy." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had lived a life filled with challenges, but also with love, resilience, and hope. And she knew that her story, her legacy, would continue to inspire others long after she was gone. The lesson of her life was simple but profound, that dignity, kindness, and compassion are the most powerful forces in the world. And that no matter who you are or where you come from, you have the power to make a difference.